It's taken me a couple seasons to get the steering on the Torqeedo Ultralight the way I want, particularly that it steers true, there's no play in the system, and that the tilt mechanism when you hit an object or come up on a beach works properly. I'm going to start at the human end and then switch to the back, because this is, I think, also an improvement on what the stock rudder pedals did. The original rudder pedals were slides that you had to adjust the pedal on the slider, and so you had to get right at where your feet go to make any adjustments. I've switched to a design from Select Designs, that's SEA-LECT, and I've used this design on my recreational kayak. It's a Eddyline Skylark, and it came with these brackets without the rudder control, and I really like the way they work. Specifically, you can adjust the rudder pedals from your seat without having to do any contortions by lifting the red handle on the end, rotating it 90 degrees, and then sliding the pedal with your toe. And in a kayak with a cockpit, it's very easy to reach everything and do it quite accurately. And so I've gotten a lot of experience using these on my Skylark. The big difference for rudder control is they've added a toe steering or toe rotation design, where pressing on the toe allows the pedal to go back and forward and pulls in the cable for steering the rudder. And as you can see, it allows your foot to stay in one location. You don't have to be making big excursions with your feet to get the boat to steer. So I don't have a whole lot of experience. I've only got a few trips on with these, but I like the way they steer, and it still remains to be seen how debris free they are. The sliding pedals, one of my displeasures with them was they'd get sand in the mechanism, and then they kind of bind when you're trying to steer. And these are supposed to be better than that, but time will tell. If they don't work very well, I will add a note on this video indicating what I found. So originally the rudder cable that came with the boat came out of this hole here and then came straight across to the foot pedal bracket, which was fine. It was a good location for that original design. But on these foot pedals, the cable goes into the top of the pedal, and so I needed to come up with a better location so my feet weren't getting tangled in the cable. So I've routed across the up above, and then I've put a little holder here for the sleeve, and that seems to be working fine. So one of the interesting problems with getting a nice clean rudder control with the Torqeedo motor, or steering control, is that you're having to balance two competing sets of forces. One is the motor wants to be able to pivot so you can avoid objects, or when you hit an object that tilts up. But if you hook the triangle bracket directly to your rudder cables, if you pull on both of them at the same time, it also pulls the motor up. And I found that when I first tried that, it was really hard to keep a rudder pedal with the right weight on them to keep it from pulling up, especially when you're trying to do a hard corner. So that's one problem I wanted to solve. I've seen some people move the triangle bracket from above the pivot point to below, and that solves the issue of the motor pulling up when you're pulling on the rudder cable, since the point's down here. But then it means that the motor can't tilt up, if it's at least not very far, when it hits something, because it has to, both rudder pedals then have to move to allow this to pivot back. And if you hit an object unexpectedly and you've got both your feet on the pedals, you're not going to be able to react fast enough to let the motor swing up properly. So that was one of the big things I wanted to solve with the design I have here. And secondly, and one of the things this iteration of the design fixes was, over time there'd be some slack develop, particularly in these cords here, and at the end of the day I'd have to be pushing extra hard to get it to steer one way, and then it'd go too far, and you'd have to counter steer, and it was a nuisance. So one of the big goals this year was to fix that, and I believe I have. But going back to the basics, which I had last year, was to fix the problem of the rudder cables pulling directly on the Torqeedo. Was I added an intermediate swivel plate, which is this guy right here. It's mounted to the original rudder bracket, which is this black object here, and there's where the rudder axle went through. I've now got a bolt that this plate then pivots on. And you notice on this boat, the cable, where the cable comes out and where the height of the triangle bracket is, it's a considerable distance, which is why I ended up with this two-tier plate with an additional line to bridge the gap. One reason I went with a line here is so that when it does rotate, there's nothing binding that rotation. So I've thought about using a steel cable initially, but it would tend to want to kink or bind when the rotation occurred. So I'll say this is the same plate that I had last year in the 2016 video. The one difference I did is I did increase the length of these eye bolts to get it up a little bit higher. It gave me a little bit better angle for attaching the lines. The big change was what occurs in here and here. Last year, I had a problem with this guy stretching, and it was really hard to get the knots in the right position to make this the right tension on it. So I've switched to a system that I can adjust the tension. This is a rod end, which is a term I didn't know until I started looking for the advice I needed. There are actually two of them, one going through the triangle bracket, and then the second one having the line going through it. And a rod end is like an eye bolt, except that it's got a lot heftier eye, and the opening in the eye is the right diameter to accept the shaft diameter of the rod. So you can see it passes through there. I've got nylocks on either side to lock it in place, and it can easily swivel back and forth or back and forth on the triangle bracket. So that allows me to adjust it to the right tension and at least fix part of the problem. And then the other big change was switching from typical outdoor cord to a product designed for sailing, and it's a synthetic cord that has basically zero stretch, and certainly on the lengths I'm using it at, it is zero stretch. So this stuff, Vectran I believe it's called, will not stretch over the course of a day, and should solve that problem also. So I believe that's solved all the problems that I've had before. It's the amount I've used it so far, there has been no issues with it developing slop over the course of a day. The other big difference is that I found a lubricant that should give me a nice clean movement on all these rotational fittings, and also handle the salt water just fine. And that product is Tef Gel, which is a product that has Teflon, powdered Teflon in a very kind of sticky coating that will sand up to salt water and actually into fuel, gasoline and the like, but at the same time has very low friction. So I've used that now extensively on my hardware to prevent seizing on the stainless steel, and also as a lubricant on every place that I've got motion. And there's a picture of the product. It's a little bit spendy, but this size container will last me the rest of my life, given I'm working with a kayak. So it's, in my experience with it so far, has indicated it's well worth the initial expense.